All right, folks. Hello and welcome back to online English class. Today we're going to be working on OTN 3, which analyzes the rising action of Marlowe's journey from pages 59 to 67. Okay, so the rising action, obviously referring to um, after the exposition of his journey narrative, which describes the process of him leaving Europe, okay, and heading towards equatorial Africa. This is going to rise to a climax where he is going to finish his journey, all right, in the inner station, and then begin the process of heading back home in the following action and resolution. Okay, so during this analysis, we're going to investigate a number of key scenes from the first phase of the rising action of Marlowe's journey narrative. But before we do that, all right, before we analyze some images of industrial waste, and analyze the ironic descriptions of the native Africans and their European masters in this scene. We're just going to conduct an SQ3R today. So today is going to be relatively light and relatively quick. It might be a good day for you to spend some time working on your quarter 4 essay in the time that you might have allotted to listening to a lecture and taking notes. All right, so this is the last day of the week. It's Friday, April 17th. All right, obviously, you should have already sent me your reading check for this past week. That's long due. It was due on Tuesday. Your reading for part 1 and the beginning of part 2 needs to be emailed to me by next Monday. All right, so don't forget about that over the weekend. You need to have written and completed OTN 1. Doesn't need to be in formal prose. All right, doesn't need to be in essay form. Doesn't need to be in paragraph form. Just class notes. Keeping up with what we're going through in class. And then OTN 2 also needs to be complete. And then obviously you need to begin the process of working on OTN 3 today. All right, as I said earlier, you need to continue the drafting process for quarter 4 essay. Today might be a good day to jump into that because we're going to get done with this SQ3R pretty quickly. All right, and we'll be finishing up OTN 3 on Monday. All right, so if you will, and you could go ahead and turn in your text to page 59, all right, which describes the process of Marlowe setting out on a French steamship, okay, for equatorial Africa. He leaves Europe, he leaves England, he leaves Belgium, he travels on a French steamer, okay, so all of Europe is kind of involved in the action here of getting Marlowe down to where he is going to be going. All right, so let's go ahead and just quickly survey the basic details of the text. All right, who is our speaker? Well, obviously, it's Marlowe. He is our first-person narrator, which is to say he's a character he is the main character of his own story. He's the first-person participant narrator. He is the protagonist of the pilgrimage that he is describing. So very similar to the pilgrim in Dante's Inferno. He is kind of the main character in his own story, all right? And he is, like the pilgrim in Dante's Inferno, looking back on his experiences during his pilgrimage or journey to the Congo, all right? The exposition of the narrative, which basically illustrated the frame of mind and belief system with which Marlowe began his narrative, again, very similar to Canto 1 of Dante's Inferno, where he, like the pilgrim, is looking for a light, looking for a kind of sacred fire, looking to understand his heart and understand whether or not there is an idea that redeems the darkness and chaos of his world, and also the darkness and chaos of his own heart, and by extension, the hearts of all men. Okay, so he's on a very similar kind of journey as the pilgrim is in the Inferno. Marlowe alludes heavily to Dante's Inferno. Conrad alludes heavily to Dante's Inferno throughout the course of Heart of Darkness. Okay, except, right, Marlowe, unlike, say, the pilgrim, does not have a divine entity who has chosen him, loved him, and is weaving together his experiences into something meaningful. Okay, rather, Marlowe, very much unlike the pilgrim in this way, it is up to him to develop and weave together the meaning of this narrative. If there is truth to be found, it will be Marlowe's to discover, not God's to reveal. Very interesting, very different uh, expression of the basic worldview of Marlowe as it differs from Dante's Christian worldview. Right? So our genre and our style here, it's a journey narrative. Okay, it's just a symbolic pilgrimage, very similar once again to Dante's Inferno. All right, so like the pilgrim in Dante's Inferno, Marlowe begins his journey looking for light. And to find it, he goes to the quote-unquote center of the earth. Okay, so consider this very poorly drawn map of Marlowe's journey. He begins in England, which instead of drawing England, I have drawn a box. All right, because that is the extent of my artistic ability. And then he crosses the English Channel into mainland Europe, all right, where he goes to the quote-unquote sepulchral city, all right, the whitewashed tomb of a city, Brussels, which indicates his suspicion that perhaps his society is based on hollow or hypocritical moral and spiritual foundations, but he's got to find out. Okay, so what does he do? Very much like the pilgrim, right? He goes from this uninvestigated surface life. Okay, so think of the map of Dante's pilgrimage, right? He goes from the dark wood, which is on the surface of a kind of uninvestigated heart, all right, and he journeys into the literal center of the earth, very similar to the ways in which Conrad's pilgrim Marlowe is going to journey to the center or the equator of the world. And Marlowe, again, significantly says, I felt like when I was going on my journey, I wasn't going to the center of a continent. I wasn't just going to the center of this big rectangle called Africa. I was rather going to the center of the earth, to the core of the earth. Okay, remember who was at the core of the earth in Dante's Inferno? Well, Satan, all right? And that was the most significant revelation that the pilgrim needed to be confronted with in order for him to understand his own personal heart of darkness and then to exit hell and once more see the light of the stars. Okay, so the narrative ends in hope. It ends with the light of the stars burning through the darkness, illuminating the darkness of the pilgrim's heart, promising redemption. Okay, so much in the same way, Marlowe heads to equatorial Congo looking for something, an idea at the back, at the heart of, at the center of his uninvestigated life. Okay? All right. So what's the title of this section of text? Well, it's just part 1, pages 59 to 67. This portion of the narrative constitutes the first leg of the rising action of Marlowe's journey, which can be depicted as follows. All right, so obviously it's a frame narrative. On the outside of the frame, all right, Marlowe and his friends or his crew on the Nelly are sitting together. There is a transition from dusk to night that occurs during the course of the narrative. All right. And Marlowe's journey, which is told within or on that ship, right, begins with him leaving Europe, which we analyzed in our previous OTN. All right, the rising action begins with his first experience in a kind of canto called the Outer Station, the first trading station of the Belgian Congo Company. He then moves on to the next station called the Central Station, right, after a 200-mile hike inland. Okay, and then he ends after navigating up the Congo River on a steamship at the Inner Station, all right, where he meets a man named Kurtz. And then the falling action and resolution of the journey narrative is his journey back home. Okay, the narrative ends, and then the story finishes with night or midnight on the Thames. Okay, so how does the style of Marlowe's narration in the first leg of the rising action characterize him as pilgrim? How does it illustrate the significance of his journey as he attempts to discover and uncover, all right, the heart or internal truths that are at the core, the heart of both his world and himself and his society? Okay, very fundamental kinds of questions that all human beings in some way or another ask themselves. All right, or simply naively accept, like the narrator, the first narrator, of course. Okay, so what happens in this section of text? Well, let's just quickly summarize what we see in pages 59 through 67. All right, first and foremost, on page 59, Marlowe sets out for the Congo on a French steamer. Okay, he personifies the African coast, which is a kind of motif through the course of the narrative, the personification of natural environments. All right, that do not have literal personalities. Okay, but are figuratively described by Marlowe. And he sort of personifies the African coast, smiling, frowning, inviting, grand, mean, and insipid. Okay, so these are obviously contradictory kinds of descriptions that just illustrate the ways in which Marlowe doesn't understand yet the nature of the enigma that is Africa, the enigma that is also, obviously, his own heart. Okay, so as he moves deeper and deeper into the heart of the Congo, the African continent, so too will he journey deeper and deeper into his own soul. All right. Throughout the course of the journey, Marlowe is just sort of troubled by what he sees. Okay, he sees things that he describes as, quote, incomprehensible. Things like the fact that men drown as they're dropping them off in the surf. And no efforts to rescue them are undertaken, and they just kind of move on as if it doesn't matter. This doesn't make a lot of sense to Marlowe, because if the whole point of colonizing the Congo is to make it more humane, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the sort of value of these human beings' lives to just be tossed away, drowned in the ocean, as if they didn't matter. Then they pass by a French warship, all right, that is obviously making war on or some rebellious native African tribe. Okay, this once again is a kind of incomprehensible kind of battle. All right, as these French individuals make war on the individuals that they are supposed to be teaching how to be more humane, to be less savage, to be more civil. Okay, on the board the ship, he finds out when they drop off some mail there that the sailors are dying at the rate of 3 per day of fever. Okay, so coronaviruses are obviously struck hard on board of that French steamer, and once again just seems to undercut the purpose of fighting the war in the first place. Ironically, the French, despite their superior technology, are losing. Okay. Um, Marlowe goes on to refer to his journey as directly as a pilgrimage here. Okay, this is language that he's going to adopt and to maintain throughout the course of the rest of the narrative. Once again, making the allusions to Dante's Inferno even more explicit. All right, not just implicit, which they're obviously implied, but they are also explicitly articulated here. Okay. He then finally arrives at the mouth of the Congo River, heads 30 miles upriver to the first trading station that he is going to spend 10 days at, which feel like a quote-unquote eternity to him, once again alluding to Inferno, a kind of eternal landscape. All right, so he says he stayed there for 10 days. It felt like an eternity. All right, yeah, he has a brief conversation with a Swedish man who basically says, "This is not a great place." All right, a person that I knew recently hung himself, and Marlowe says, "Why in the world would he do that?" And the Swede says, "Honestly, I don't know." All right. They finally arrive at the outer station, and all around him he sees mostly black and mostly naked African laborers moving around, quote unquote, like ants. Okay, the sunlight is extremely blinding. All around, there is the continuous noise or roar of the rapids of certain rougher sections of the river around the trading station. Okay, and he sees a kind of boiler, an engine that is just wallowing in the grass, a railway truck lying on its back with its wheels in the air. Um, he hears the blasts, objectless blasting of the Belgian company just blowing up elements of the landscape to make way for, I don't know, new buildings. He avoids a vast artificial hole that somebody had been digging on the slope that he cannot figure out the purpose of. What is the point of this vast artificial hole, he thinks to himself. All of these obviously are symbolic observations or meant to be read symbolically, which we'll unpack on Monday. He walks past a sort of African chain gang guarded by a paid African native. Okay, a chain gang is just a group of criminals, quote unquote criminals, who are all chained together. And he says, ironically, that I was a part of these great, high, and just proceedings. Okay, so obviously Marlowe's impression of the sacred fire is not doing so great here. He's having a hard time even figuring out what's going on around him. It seems to be chaotic. It seems to be pointless. It seems to be, importantly, meaningless. There doesn't seem to be an idea at the back of this labor at all. Okay. He then has an extended conversation with an individual named the accountant. All right. The accountant doesn't have an actual name. He is named his job. He is just simply an accountant. And this accountant, all right, who is surrounded by individuals who are dying slowly all around him of various diseases and sicknesses, which was a very common thing in places that Europeans colonized. All right, they would bring with them diseases to which the native population would have no immunity, and then droves of them would die, and those that developed antibodies would live on and then serve their new European masters, typically. All right. A very similar thing happened to Native American populations in America. Okay. Marlowe walks into this shaded area, sees a bunch of these sickening and dying individuals all around him that are described as bundles of acute angles. Once again, that language alludes to Inferno. And then he comes in contact with this perfectly dressed accountant. All right, and the accountant, he sort of ironically says he has great respect for, and that this accountant has great backbone. We'll talk about the irony of Marlowe's statements there. Okay. Finally, the accountant introduces him to a name that you should remember and that Marlowe will remember through the course of his journey, Mr. Kurtz. All right, this man named Kurtz. Okay, he calls him a remarkable person. All right, he says that one day Kurtz will probably be a somebody in the administration, the Belgian government, before long. Okay. And so there's no telling how powerful this guy Kurtz will become. All right, so this is obviously an individual who Marlowe wants to pay attention to, an individual who Marlowe is attracted to right from the onset because he is, quote unquote, remarkable. He is a first-class agent. He's excellent at his work. He, if anyone, is going to be the kind of person who bears the sacred fire, who understands it, and who works for a purpose. All right. So, all right, in Marlowe's first experiences in the outer station, they come to a close whenever he takes a 200-mile tramp, a 200-mile foot journey to the next kind of canto or next stopping point on his journey called the Central Station. All right, that's all for today. That concludes our recitation of what happens from pages 59 to 67. You can spend the rest of your day working on your essay or catching up on your OTNs or finishing up your reading, but we'll finish analyzing this piece of text on Monday. Hope you guys have an excellent weekend.